Spencer Scott Holmes here, and welcome to the show. Today I got super special guest, Jade Lowder. He makes a comic. It's a horror show, and we're going to talk all about that in a moment, plus all the fun things of just indie comic creations in general. But first, I just want to say I got Pizza Boys 14 pretty much done and ready. By the time this episode's up, it should pretty much be just about at least up on Amazon, Kindle/Comixology. Prints will come later down the line. But, hey, if anything, check it out right there. Get the digital dip in first and so on like that. Enjoy the book. It's on Kindle Unlimited, Comixology Unlimited. If you got any of those things set and ready to go, I mean, we got Kung Fu Good Times coming ahead. If you like that 80s, 90s era of American-made martial arts things, well, that's like the theme to this whole book in fun, slice-of-life humor style, sitcom glory. The new Pizza Boys. It's going to be a fun romp. Can't say that more. Go to oldmanorange.com. That's where you'll check out more stuff. Getting these podcasts kind of rolling, getting some guests in, so on like that. Plus, beyond that, there's always Old Man Orange podcast and via VHS. We're going down all sorts of classic roads of all these old movies, / doing some kind of commercial stuff, comic book stuff. There's a lot of fun things going on. But yeah, let's jump onto the show. Let's get to the interview part. Got Jade here. We just have a fun old time. Met him over at one of the Comic-Cons and just connected right off the bat. So let's jump on in.
Right, whatever, kind of a thing. And then eventually it's time to just okay, send it,
Done.
I can only do this so many times,
Gosh, I know that's always the key thing is. The worst part too is there's a certain point where you just gotta, you just can't almost even look at it anymore. And it's funny because then you'll come back to it 2 years later and then you'll go, oh my gosh, has that been there the whole time like that? Why has nobody said anything?
Yeah. And I mean, it's even worse sometimes when you're working with a partner and they don't notice it either. And you're like, how did nobody saw this? Yeah, for sure.
No, when it comes to those checks, the thing that I've been doing lately on Pizza Boys is by the time I finish an issue, I've been sending it out to 15 plus people or so to kind of read it over and give me the extra A-okay. And the thing that I really learned about that is I remember sending it out to about 15 people the first time I tried that. And nobody came back with the same error twice. So that goes to show how much stuff goes over people's heads. So it's almost that's where I feel like it's more important to have actually a lot more people look at it. Knowing that, some people aren't going to notice things as much as others, but at least hopefully that kind of gets it where it's pretty darn okay. We saw a mixed match of people looking at it, and hopefully somebody kind of caught it. And those things that a lot of times there's those other ones where if nobody saw it, I guess, and 15 plus extra reads, then probably the average person's not going to catch it their first time around at least.
No, for sure. And I think too that as creators, you will always be the ones that are the most kind of critical about that kind of stuff. You'll look back at it because I know I've put out stuff and people are like, no, this looks fine. I'm like, you don't understand. You don't. It's I know where the problems are in this, and maybe you're missing it and stuff like that. And I know that when you're just too close to it, sometimes you lack that perspective to just be like, no, it is indeed good enough. This is indeed fine. I don't need to be as critical as I'm being about this particular, drawing or lettering or whatever the case may be,
Yeah, no, I definitely think that that's a very important skill to have is to know when to kind of go, okay, it's good enough. You know what I mean? Let's carry on. Should I fret over this forever or should I just start working on a brand new project, at the end of the day? There just comes a point where you go, you know what? It's good enough. It's like when it comes to the artwork, I have a thing where I call it the 90% rule. It's just got to be about 90% good. Once it's at the 90%, okay, yeah. I'm not redrawing anything like that. It's good to go. The next panel, or else I feel you watch those people where they try to get 100% and they do the thing where they write a comic and they get about 1/3 of the way through and they're like, no, I need to erase this and start from the beginning again. And it's like, no, keep going at least.
Yeah, that's how you set yourself up to never finish anything, And I think that sometimes it can be the bad part about digital and how many times you can you can do different edits and like, oh, I can move that around and I can move this around and I can make this bigger and this littler, and so on and so forth. And you can edit and edit and edit and edit. And then the heart of what that thing was gets lost somewhere. And it's like you've overworked this to the point of like it doesn't mean anything anymore. And this drawing, it's lost that spark. It's kind of like I have this friend who will do different levels of layouts, and will do his roughs might be really finessed if he's working for someone who wants to see it like a lot more finished, so they get a sense of like how things are going to work together. Or he will work sometimes where it's really, really loose. And he said that when you do the really tight layouts before you get to the finals, the problem is like that the drawing is almost dead. Like the life is gone because the life was in those initial layouts that got tighter. And when you get to the final, it's just like they're just kind of like they don't have that same spark as the first time you draw them. And I think that's something you can kind of see when you watch people draw digitally and then they edit and edit and edit, and then it's like it's done now. It's over. Yeah.
Hey, well, I understand that. Even sometimes too, it's like every once in a while when you have like the sketch and then you go to ink it, but then you feel like the sketch almost looks sometimes better than the ink did.
Totally.
You're like, well, this one's like, man, I almost smoothed it out too much in the process. It lost a little bit of its edge.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that happens all the time, and I think that there's different ways to like try and combat it, but sometimes I think it's kind of the nature of the beast, of like if you want it to be perfect, it's going to lose a little bit of that edge because it's just it's not that rough sketch, like if you're cool with the rough sketch, and I know some dudes totally are when they get to drawing pages, they feel like rough sketches, but I don't know. I think that like you get to a certain level and you just got to be okay with it.
Yeah, I think
like,
that's
all right. Well,
yeah, you just kind of give it some feeling, and yeah, as I said, don't worry too much. I think that, as I said, that 90% rule, I've kind of utilized that for the longest time of like, there, because that last 10%, you'll spend way more time trying to get that accomplished than that whole previous 90%, which is really all anybody's looking at anyways. Totally. That last 10% is like the one that you might notice that, but everybody else is going to be, it's kind of like when you read a comic and like, you kind of realize how fast you sort of read over a panel. You don't think about it, but if you stop to go like, you time yourself when you look at it, you go, I look at that panel for like 3 to 4 seconds, maybe, give or take on how much dialogue's in there and so on like that. I remember as a kid, I thought about that after a while when I was just reading through a bunch of like Spider-Man books or something like that. I'm like, maybe I need to slow down a little bit because I feel like, am I even really seeing the artwork, or is it sort of flashing in sort of the background, And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna speed it down a little bit. No more like, don't speed read these things.
Yeah, and I mean, I also think it's like it sometimes it's dependent on the artist to like the speed in which you read it. Like to use Spider-Man as an example, and some like the Marvel and DC guys, right? Like you read those books and it's like, did I look at anything in this book? Like I know the story, like I remember the story, but like I go back and like, what the hell even happened? And I think that some of those books are almost designed to just be read like that, just like boom, 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 and not necessarily spend super time. And then you get to like some dudes and you see their artwork and you're like, oh my God, I just have to spend as long as it takes to look at this page because this is so amazingly drawn or whatever. And then you slow down and then you realize like, oh man, the pace in which I read different books is kind of radical. Like I think there are artists that I totally take my time and it's like very slow and I'm looking at each page and I'm like, oh my God, this is incredible. And then I almost have to like read it again because I'm like, I don't think I read it. I think I was just looking.
Well, I know that's how I kind of got to the point where it's like where I'll read it and then I make sure I look at the art and then I go to the next panel. Like there's kind of like beats to everything to really take it all in. And I think that's always been kind of the way. It's like just slow it down and there you go and so on like that, and absorb everything.
Totally. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I know we just sort of got this podcast rolling, but Jade Lowder here, I just wanted to say we met over at the Comics Verse Comic-Con by Impound Comics in Sacramento about a couple months ago by now. how they all roll together and so on like that. But it actually kind of amazed me because when I was like, hey, we do a podcast, you're like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm also Mountain Time. I'm like, oh really? You've actually traveled farther than I did to a Comic-Con? Because like for the longest time, like I always go to the Sacramento ones. Everybody thought I lived in Sacramento. I'm like, no, I just drive 2 hours and 40 minutes to get here every single time.
Yeah, I mean, I took like a 6-hour plane trip to get to, I'm up here in Montana. And so Sacramento, that Comic Con was actually my first con as behind the table. I've gone to a couple as a fan, and then that was my first actually get it, like doing the whole tabling experience. And it seemed like a good one to kind of like kind of cut my teeth on. It seemed like a kind of a smaller con, a lot more like indie guys that were there instead of, just being all these big hitters that you kind of see in other cons. And I was like, I think this will be a good one to just kind of try it out, see how it goes. And if I make mistakes, it's not like, it's okay. And I can kind of edit for the next one,
Yeah, no, that probably was about, you probably could have timed that better as being like a perfect, like one right size. There was a crap ton of like indie guys there, which a lot of times that doesn't always happen at certain conventions. Cause I've been to some where I kind of go, oh, I'm the only person selling, his own comic book, I mean, there might be some like, back issue guys, but beyond that, it's kind of a weird when you're in places. It's called a Comic-Con, but there's less than 10% of things are actually comic books.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a weird moment. You walk in and like it's a lot of like anime or toy stuff, which I mean, they have their place in that kind of a arena and whatever. But yeah, when it's like the title is Comic-Con, I'm like, it sets an expectation, and then you go in and there's not a whole lot of comic people there. It's like this, okay. Weird, but all right,
I know that's always been kind of the bummer to some of the slightly bigger ones, is that I just noticed every, in the last, like, I don't know, maybe 8 years or so, I noticed that the comic books progressively get smaller and smaller and smaller, and everything else, the television, the games and all that other stuff. And there's nothing wrong with any of that stuff, but what is the title of the place? Let's go back to the beginning. Like, is this television con? Is this video game con? It's like, no, I thought it was Comic-Con. I thought that's what it said outside. Am I wrong? Did I walk into the wrong one?
Yeah, no, I feel like in the future, I don't know if that's just going to always be the way that it's going, or whatever. Because I know that like Marvel and DC have started to like back off from having such a big heavy presence at a lot of comic conventions. I'm signed up to go to Baltimore Comic-Con in like 2 weeks. Cool. Yeah, it's gonna be great. But I was like looking at who was going to be like vendors and who's the exhibitors and stuff like that. And I can't remember. I think it was. I think Marvel's going to be there, but DC doesn't have like a booth set up. And I found that just totally weird. I was like, really? That's just, or maybe it's the other way around. It's one of the big two.
Yeah, one of the others not there.
And it feels weird. It's like, okay, but this was like your baby. These Comic-Cons, and they're stepping back, and it's kind of weird. I don't know. I don't know what that says about the future of cons and the future of the industry if the big two are kind of stepping back from that stuff. But maybe it just means that, like, hey, little guys like us, the indie creators, we're going to get more of that center stage. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
No, that's not a bad one. My only kind of sometimes my issue has been the last couple of years of some of the conventions is they cram so much different stuff in there. And I go like this, that's great for the guy selling tickets at the front door. The more things you shove in there, even better. But you kind of, the one thing I've kind of learned when it comes to selling books is that I feel like there's two types of people. There's people that read and people that don't read. And generally, if somebody doesn't read, it's like the equivalent of trying to sell someone a car who doesn't drive. Like, what are they going to do with it? And they might like the way it looks. They go, oh, that's got a cool looking paint job. It looks flashy and everything like that. But, at the end of the day, if they're not going to read, they're not going to read. And I think that's sometimes kind of the downfall is like they get these Comic-Cons and they sort of they advertise them so, maybe not like broadly, but like it kind of just gets everybody out of the woodworks to show up. And there's a lot of those, like, I kind of hate to sort of say it, but lollygaggers. They come in like, I had $5 in my pocket to get in the front door. I don't plan on spending a dime more. I'm just going to come take a look around and so on like that. And you're like, oh, okay, once again, cool for the guy selling tickets at the front door. Once
Sure.
again, that. And then the other thing too is, the other thing I noticed is a lot of people don't always have, like, if they're into like one thing, that might be all they're into. Like, so if they come in for
Yeah,
wrestling,
totally.
they don't like anything else. If they come in for manga, that is it. And beyond anime, they could care less. And
Yeah.
I'm one of those people, like, I actually like a lot of stuff. I love video games. I like wrestling. I love comic books. I actually like movies and all that good stuff. Like, all multimedia stuff is all kind of cool with me, but I noticed that's not the case for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That was something that I kind of experienced is you'd have fans and you could almost like tell, especially if they were in cosplay, I could kind of start seeing this. Like if they were cosplayed as like a comic book character, there was a good chance that they might buy a book. But if they were cosplaying as something that was like anime or video game, no way. They're not going to buy, because there was a different audience. You're totally right.
Yeah.
That was not the audience, and it's kind of funny to notice that. But that's a good observation. That there are these like seemingly different crowds of people that are there, and sometimes they mix, and it seems like that vast majority are very kind of like singular, like you're saying. I agree with that. Yeah.
Well, that's because I've had that thing before. Somebody comes by and be like, "Hey, you into indie comics?" Or they're like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! I only read manga." And it's like, and I always kind of hate to sort of say, but like, let's be honest, what's the difference? I read all kinds of comic books. I don't care if they're European, American, Japanese. Like, I literally like all of them, and it's like it doesn't even bat an eye. Like, I can literally go from reading a right to left book to a left to right book, no problem. I can switch back and forth between issues. I'm just so used to it because I read through so many of them. So it always throws me off when someone thinks it's like, it's the same way too. It's like, so I'm assuming you only watch anime and you never watch an American cartoon.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that kind of singular mentality ends up just kind of like, it's tunnel vision. You're not getting everything that you possibly could, It's just like, yeah, so you like manga. Okay, but like a lot of manga was inspired by American comics and back and forth. It's the same thing if you only read American comics. It's like, okay, you are missing out on a huge spectrum of things, And I think that like it just cuts you off from the potential of getting to experience your next big love if you're only reading or only watching this one particular version of this like big universe.
Oh yeah, totally. I think it is, and I think that's it's always kind of a bummer when it's just like there's so much cool stuff out there. Why even limit yourself? See, I feel like I have the problem where there's so much cool stuff, there's no way to keep up. That's the problem that I feel like I face. It's like that sort of thing that, like, I remember my buddy said this once. He's like, you know what? There's going to be a time that there's a brand new Batman movie, and I won't be alive to see it. It's just like, yeah, there's things like that. We're just gonna, you know what I mean? It's just you're gonna run all that time to catch up on everything.
Yeah. There's, it used to be, especially for like kind of like nerd, geeky kind of fandom stuff, very limited content. It was like you get your big movie, the X-Men or whatever, and that was like it. In terms of like being made into a TV show or that kind of cross back and forth. And now it's become such a, everything is being made into a TV show, a movie, or an animated series. And there's only so much time in the day. And I'm like, everybody's telling me, oh, you got to watch the show. It's based on that comic. I'm like, oh, it was a great comic. I read the comic though. Like, I don't know that I need to see the show because I read it already, and I'll just watch something I haven't seen or know the story already,
Yep. Oh, dude, I totally get that. Well, because like my thing is what I've kind of done is I cut TV off. TV was the one I'm like, what's my least favorite of everything? There's not enough time in the day. I'm like, I'm just going to stick with movies, comics, and video games. That's the three that I like. I feel like, TV, it takes up way more time. I always feel like, to me, I'm just not always into it nearly as much and stuff. So I'm like, and a lot, that's like these people go, man, they got this great, show based off the comic. I'm like, let's be honest, it's going to be as good as a comic book. I hate to sort of say it, but
yeah, no, I like.
I'm not saying it can't be, but
I mean, I would argue that like anything that was based off the original comic book, and maybe this is just a snob in me, and that's totally fine too. I'm nothing but a giant snob when it comes to the shit I like, but I always go with like, yeah, the original is always going to be just slightly better because the next version of the person who's doing it is just kind of, it's so complicated, right? You have to do the fan service. You have to make it so that like the original fans are going to like it, but then you have to put your own little spin on it to sell it. You've got to, if there's no romance, you got to cram a romance in there. You got to figure out how to do that and sell it to Hollywood and all that kind of stuff. And I think that you just kind of end up with something that doesn't exactly translate to what originally was the power of that piece, and I think that like there's so many examples of where great piece of art in comic book form translated to another medium, huge flop, and it's just it's kind of embarrassing to look at, and you're like, oh my god, that's I swear the book is better, and I think that's just ends up what even the good ones, there are good ones out there, but they're still like, yeah, but the book is still better. It's still better.
Yeah. Well, it's that one that like, especially with like mangas and so on, that's been my thing is instead of watching the anime, I've just been kind of reading the manga series because I feel like I'm getting the pure, interpretation of it. Like in a sense, it's one main person with three underlings that never get credited. I feel like that's always I always think about that in regular comics too. I'm like, how many people work on these books though that don't get credit? Because there's got to be, there's the core people, but then everybody might have their own assistants and so on like that never get their name in there. And who knows how much work they do. But, but whatever, let's just say it's the core one person. It hasn't filtered through a bunch of producers, hasn't gone through a bunch of different animators. It's just a singular kind of vision. And so I kind of like that experience where I'm like, I'm just going to go through it that way. I mean, is it the cheapest way? No, not comparative to like, of course, watching a show is cheaper than buying books, but I don't know what it is. Just something about just like this, like you sort of get that solo vision. And I think that's one of my favorite ways with kind of comic books and so on like that, especially mangas.
I like that. Yeah. And I mean, I think too, like, to take like the example of like, let's say like Akira, right? And you look at like Akira, it wasn't made into a series, into that film, and the film is like fantastic, but it's like it's a fraction of all that you get if you read all of Akira. It's just like there's just so much more that you can get from the series if you actually read it. And then Otomo's drawings are just unreal. Unreal.
Those books are cool. I really like those ones. There's got some great, amazing artwork in there and so on. It's like, was it 5 or 6 big volumes? I think is what it.
Yeah. I think it's 6. I don't remember. It's in my bookshelf behind me, but like,
I was gonna say I haven't read through it in like, I don't know, 12 plus years, but yeah. But yeah, that's a good one. But speaking of comic books, I was going to say, why don't you talk a little bit about yours? It's a horror show. I always go the wrong direction when I'm trying to show it in the weird.
So It's a Horror Show is kind of my first comic book that I've put out there. The date is the kind of first full length version of it. I have a mini comic I did before that, but It's a Horror Show is essentially. It's an anthology series that I'm starting to develop, and the next kind of one will come out in. Right now, it's kind of slotted for April. It's on the drawing board. It's nowhere near done, but like April, I got time.
I understand that one.
But it's a horror anthology series. It's mostly kind of like campy horror. So it's it's if I had to put a pin in it, I would say something like Return of the Living Dead is kind of where my head is at. So it's like it's got horror elements to it, but it knows what it is. It's just kind of making fun of itself in a lot of ways. And it's usually this kind of silly stories. So It's a Horror Show. The date is about a punk rock werewolf traveling the desert, and he has this kind of chance encounter with a what appears to be a damsel in distress, but that's not all that she appears to be. And it's just this kind of fun story of he's in a punk band. He takes her out on this date, and there's all kinds of mayhem and chaos that kind of get caused by these two. And so it was, just a simple idea I had that was kind of based off of a music video, actually, for the Cramps. I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and like the original music video for it is like the Cramps all crammed into this hot rod, cruising down the desert. And I was like, man, I love that just image of them. Like, why do they have to be in the desert? How does that relate to a werewolf? I have no idea, but I love it. And so I just kind of like from there, I was like, well, what if I did like a punk rock werewolf in a hot rod, driving in the desert? And then I just kind of like started riffing on that character. and the story kind of developed from there. And so now, like, every iteration of this series of It's a Horror Show is kind of its own standalone story. That's kind of the same thing. It's just me taking like a goofy idea and saying like, hey, what if I did that, and kind of just blew it up a little bit and see what would have happened if I played with that trope or something like that in the genre.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's got that cool rockabilly horror punk rock. You know, the artwork's awesome. It gives me those kind of Tank Girl vibes. Of course, it's black
Oh,
and white.
thanks. Yeah.
I'm always partial to black and white artwork. I think that's probably why I like manga so much as well too. But you know, it's one of those ones where everything about it just got a neat look to it. And I mean, horror movies type stuff, anyways, is always a cool one to go with. And I think the idea of kind of doing it where each one's got its own sort of take is kind of nice, because then you're never stuck to being like, okay, what's the continuation I got to follow in the next one? Something like that. There's something to be said about, I've even thought about when like starting out in comics too, if you do that thing where you don't go like, oh, I got this series and it's going to be 25 issues long and all of that, like if you break from that just a little bit, and then there, you know, I've seen a couple guys do it before where like they do the thing where they create like a single, like 3 different single issues, completely different from each other. But the upside, I thought that I was like, you could sort of try out what you want to try and kind of give it a shot. And then whatever one kind of catches on a little bit more, well, then, you know, okay, maybe I'll make a second one of that, you know, I think, but you're not so committed to like the giant length, you know, shonen manga story, you know, the superhero epic and all that kind of stuff. There's something that is to be said about having that, especially in like an anthology style. The next one, all it has to do is kind of be in that similar vibe, but it can be a completely different story.
Yeah, totally. And I think that was something that I did, you know, somewhat strategically of it partly because I don't have an idea for something that is long and kind of continuous like that. Like I don't know. It's I have these like stupid one-off little ideas. I'm like, it just seems so silly to me. I want to see where it goes for an issue, and then maybe it goes somewhere down the line, like the monstrous band that's in the is in the date that the werewolf plays in this band with. I've done a couple like short stories with them, and I've kind of continued their story a little bit in like some actual anthology comics after this book was released, and that's been fun just to kind of play with that cast of characters again. But I don't necessarily know that I want to like have them be the returning always. You know, it was like, yeah, it made sense for what I was doing, but I'm not sold on them yet. I actually got this piece of advice from I was taking some classes through the Kubert school just to kind of like get more, you know, comfortable making comics and whatnot. And I took this class from Dan DiDio. And one of the pieces of advice that he said was just like, getting into the business and whatnot, do something small, something that like is attainable, and just get it out, push it out, get it made, see what happens. And so the first thing I made was like a little mini comic that was like the first It's a Horror Show, and it was just these 2 little short stories, and it was something I knew I could just I could get it done, put it out, get it in print, see what it looks like, and then from there, then it kind of like spawned like, oh, now I can make this next werewolf book, and then I can kind of keep building it from there. But I don't have to be saddled with like this epic story that I'm just like trying to complete over the next 10 years or whatever. I can just kind of roll these books out when I have time, and I don't have to worry about like, oh shoot, what did that character look like in issue 4 back there and stuff like that. I can kind of just have it be its own contained thing. And you're right, like try it out. Is this the story that I want to pull out later and flush out a little bit more, or is this was a standalone and move on to the next thing? And so it was a little bit strategic, but it's also me just like, I don't have the big story. I have like all these little tiny ideas, and I'm kind of happy just playing in my little sandbox with these tiny little stories and seeing what happens.
Well, see, the cool thing about that too is then you can switch genres. Then you can also switch up characters, and you can just do a lot more experimentation because you haven't like, in a sense, got yourself corralled in like, a world where you're like, oh, great. Now this is what I am. Okay, this is where we got to go with, and so on like that. There's definitely something to be kind of said there. But going back to that school, how did you go about going there? Did you have to go there physically?
So no, that was actually the cool thing. So when I was a kid, I like that was something I always wanted to do, was go to the Kubert school.
Well,
And
that's why
my
I remember
parents,
seeing the ads in the back
oh
of
yeah,
Mac comics,
totally.
and that was what I always thought about. I always in my back of my mind I was like, man, if you could travel back east, because that's what I just remember it being like back in the day. Was in I
Yeah,
can't remember, was
yeah,
it
yeah.
Maryland or something like that?
Yeah, it's in Dover, New Jersey.
New Jersey. And that was the thing. I was like, if you went back there and just did a full whatever semester, however they kind of run that thing, a full summer
Mhm.
program, whatnot, I always felt like that probably would be pretty well worth it just for, a quick kind of overview and so on. But I was like, well, it's all the way back east and so on like that. So
Yeah.
that kind of wrote itself out pretty quickly.
Yeah, so like when I was a kid, I wanted to go there. Same thing, seeing the ads in the back of comic books and stuff like that. I was always like, that's what I'm going to do. And then when it came time to graduate high school and go off to college or whatever, my parents wanted me to go to an actual like four-year school, and so that's what I did. And I kind of at that time I kind of actually put comics aside, and I got 2 degrees in in painting. I have a master's degree in painting,
Well,
and I'm
that's
actually an
cool.
art. I'm an art professor. That's like my day job, is I teach art at a college here in Montana, and so I kind of put all that away. But then COVID, tons of time on your hands. Everything went remote,
Hmm.
and the Kubert School started offering online classes. And I was like, holy shit, I could essentially go to the Kubert School, take some online classes. And so that's what I did. And so I was able to take some really cool classes with some, big name professional artists that, like, you just never would be able to take a class with normally. And it was like a pretty condensed thing. It was like 6 weeks,
Hmm.
meeting one time a week. And then depending on what the class is, you'd have X amount of homework. And the homework would be like, drawing a bunch of pages as like samples to fill out a portfolio, or coloring or lettering. And so I took a whole bunch of stuff just to kind of like get back into the swing of making comics. And it was super beneficial. It was the skills I learned in it. I took a lettering class from Taylor Esposito,
Hmm.
really, really insightful about using Illustrator to letter stuff. I took a digital coloring class that was all about like using Photoshop and digital painting. Yeah, all those skills I still keep building on and using, and it was like really great to kind of like help me lay like a foundation to like look at a comic and know what to kind of look for and start analyzing to just make better books. And yeah, it was super, super helpful. Can't say enough nice things about the Kubert School. They're great.
No, that experience sounds really cool right then and there. My main way of like learning everything was I just bought tons of books. I always call it the school of Amazon. You just go on there and buy all the used books that you can,
Yeah.
and you read through them and so on. And I remember like one of the best ones too was like there was a lettering book I got because it was like when DC they had like a series of about 5 or 6 books, and each one was there was a
Mm-hmm.
penciling book, an inking book, a color or writing book, and so on. I remember that lettering book was one of the most interesting. I'm like that one there. I felt like I almost learned more out of the lettering book than all like the other ones. I think because the other things are a little bit more direct, of course, but the lettering is one of
Sure.
those ones that's just not talked about nearly as often, and all the excess
Yeah.
little stuff that goes into it. It's kind of like the it's one of the most important art or parts of a comic book, because I always think that when the lettering goes on there, that's what transforms the whole page to going like now
Totally.
it's a comic book. That's like
Now
whenever I
it's a
put
comic.
that's why
Yeah.
I love the lettering part, because when I see that finally on there, it's like the page is complete. Like even if you haven't even
Totally.
inked it yet, you're like now it looks like a comic book. There
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. Yeah, and it's one of those things. I think it's probably because it's just like, of all the things you could talk about in terms of comics, like, oh, we're going to look at the artwork and we're going to talk about, the line work in this particular character and the backgrounds and all this stuff. Lettering is just one of those things. Yeah, it's vital, super important. It really shows you how to look through a page. It can do so many amazing things, but it's almost like in many ways like the least sexy kind of part of making a comic. Not to say that making comics is particularly sexy, but like
Yeah.
of all the things, it would be at the very bottom. And ultimately, it kind of is like this almost invisible but super visible and really important thing. So much of what goes on in a lettering, in a word balloon is unless you know to look for it, it should be almost like invisible to you, and it should just
Mhm.
read normal. only when it ever is wrong, if something is bad, that does it ever stand out as like, ooh, this is bad. Because your good lettering should almost be invisible. You could almost just like read it and move and keep moving through the page. If you spend too long on that lettering, you're like, okay, there's something wrong here.
Yeah,
If I'm noticing it that bad.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because I mean, you see that every once in a while, where it's just like you even see it in professional books too, where it's like, oh, that lettering is now crisscrossing into there. Or one thing I've noticed in sometimes some of the translations of certain like mangas and stuff, and it's like they have like somewhat professional companies doing it, and you're just like, who the hell got this job? That's all I want to know. Because if this is all it takes to do it, I clearly could come in here and do this too.
Yeah. I think it's funny, and I want to know how much control they have on like the size of the balloons and stuff, because I think about it and I'm like, okay, so if it was in the original like Japanese and it's in that kind of scroll kind of script, and it takes up X amount of space, but then the English version of that takes up just like a tiny little space, why can't you just squeeze that balloon just a little bit more? And I would have to imagine, because like they probably hand drew that balloon and there's no change in it, you know.
Yeah, well, even to those ones, I always go, well, why don't you just make the words just slightly bigger? Like in that one scene, just make
That
the font just because I mean, I get like some of that stuff. I mean, I know because it is sort of like translation, so you kind of go with what you got. But sometimes you see some of them, and it's just it almost just looks like someone just went there, white out, slap in a font. Who cares what size it is? Go on, next one. Like that. That's almost what it felt like. The amount of work went in there.
No, totally.
Like, so someone didn't even have it's like, I almost feel like sometimes I go like, man, either one, this is the first time they use Photoshop and they just learned how to use like the type row, or they're not even using Photoshop. Maybe they're
not even doing
else.
that.
Yeah, maybe.
He's got like MS Paint open.
Yeah, that's it. He's painting over white and then he's typing it in. That's all it is, you know. But you know, I especially think sometimes back in like the 80s and 90s, I think like the people that were like translating, those were such like you know, it was just such a, you know, you could get that job with like nothing. You got like, I got a studio. Well, what do you got? I got a closet, a microphone, and some whiteout. Good enough. You could do both animes and mangas. Look at you. Yeah, one of those things. It didn't take a whole lot to kind of get that going, but yeah, no, that lettering is. It's always one of the most interesting parts too. Like something I've always had fun with too is with some of the onomatopoeias is making them kind of like creative in the process, where like you got sort of a phrase or something in there and be like, how can I work those words in to be where it's almost like a mixed match of both artwork and words all at the same time, and just like it's something totally unique. Every once in a while there was a couple issues I had where I just felt like, man, I got a bunch of these kind of cool little neat ideas that most people are probably just gonna read over and not think much of it, but like I thought they were pretty cool.
Yeah, totally. And I think then there's the opposite end of that spectrum, where you look at like a book and you see like an onomatopoeia and it just doesn't match. It's just like, oh, it doesn't feel like that sound effect. It doesn't match the art or whatever it could be, you know. And I think that like, again, it kind of like sometimes the power of digital is so cool. We can make all these kinds of edits and do some really great things. But I think to that, like, people don't realize the power they have. And so when they throw that in, they don't understand like why this looks not like right, why it doesn't match up to that, either that sound or again like the artwork sometimes. And it is almost like you see I think bad lettering, you know, can be forgiven in a lot of ways, like word balloons and dialogue. You know, like it's fine. Onomatopoeias stand out so harsh when they're not like fully thought out, and you're like, oh my god, like what am I looking at?
Yeah, exactly. Most definitely there. Well, it's also like when it comes down to word balloons, like I feel like I always like to draw the word balloons myself too, because for some reason when they have like the perfect, like, you know, ellipse or anything like that, the perfect circles and everything, like sometimes that can like throw off between the artwork and so on. Like, and I always thought myself like my artwork's not like perfect as is. So if my word balloons look perfect, there's something's gonna, it's too much like contrast. Like I feel like I got to organically draw them, and I always kind of like that anyways too, where like the word balloons don't have to be always a perfect circle or anything like that. Like they can form to whatever the panel and whatever the phrase is, and however it kind of works. Like it all flows together with the artwork.
Yeah, I think so. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that like, I think too, it comes down sometimes to like the style of the book as well, like
Mm-hmm.
like the genre and stuff like that. Like I think that you can read, certain books, like let's say like it's an epic fantasy or something like that. Like the last thing you want to be thinking about is like the lettering. You kind of want to just be kind of immersed in the story and stuff like that. But then you get to like an indie book, like a la like Love and Rockets and stuff like that, and you're like, well, the lettering should be a part of the artwork just as much as everything else. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that like you could look at Crumb, you could look at all kinds of dudes who do that kind of stuff where the lettering is so much a part of the artwork. And it's just like is just how you read those kinds of books. But then yeah, you get to something a lot more like action packed and stuff, and you kind of want it just clean, just like I don't
Mm-hmm.
want no fuss, just like let's just get into it. And I think that like it's just I don't know, it's a gradient sometimes of like how much you want to do and how little you want to do for the lettering. I think it totally depends on what you were trying to do in the first place.
Yeah, most definitely. And then sometimes I think the most simplest rule of thumb, and this goes for everything in a comic book, is it clear and does it make sense? I mean, unless for
Yeah.
some reason the scene's supposed to not make sense, like like that's part of it. But for the most part, as long as it's clear and makes sense, like that's really the most important thing. Like everything else can be slightly off as long as it's clear and
Yeah.
it makes sort of sense. You know what I mean? Where it's
Oh
not like one
yeah.
of those ones where you're just trying to go like, what is that letter going inside the book? It's like then things are
Hmm.
smashing up and like that, or yeah, is or it's like sometimes there's some drawings where it's like you'll look at some books and go, I don't really know where they are. Are they
Yeah.
like these backgrounds aren't really like like giving me a sense of like where they they're locked down or anything like that. It's like it looks like everybody's just sort of floating through space. And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of the key thing is like, is it clear and makes sense? Beyond
Yeah.
that, nothing else is nearly that important. Like everything else is kind of like cool if you get it down a little bit better, but as long as it's flowing, you're golden. Keep going.
Yeah, I think that's something that sometimes like gets overlooked, of just like clarity. Just always go back to clarity. Like make sure it makes sense. I was listening to this talk that was given by David Mazzucchelli, who did like Batman Year One and some
Mm-hmm.
Daredevil stuff, and he was talking about like comics. The line that you draw is in a different service. Like when you're talking about like just drawing in general, like representational drawing, like I'm going to draw that potted plant or whatever. The line is in service of the illusion. Every line that you use should be to help you mimic that potted plant, right? But
Mm-hmm.
when you get to comics, the line is in service of the story. And if it's not serving the story, it has no business on the page. And so I think that like sometimes like we get really fussy and like we do too much, and then it's just like, okay, this is not in service of the story anymore. This is in service of your ego.
Yep.
It's not doing anything for the story. And it's like, get back to clarity, what was actually important, and get rid of that. And I think that sometimes we want to make these sick cool drawings, and I love that. But I think that if it's confusing the story, it's not serving what it should be.
Or you could probably make two versions of that too, where like you have the potted plant in there and the potted plant not in there, and have somebody read it over and then be like, read both of them and go, did you notice a difference? And I bet you they'll be like, no, I didn't. Be like, you didn't notice potted plant gone? No, why would I be noticing that? Like that,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
in the
Yeah,
background. Like, I'm like, well, I thought I
yeah,
could do a pretty good job
doesn't
drawing that
matter.
potted plant. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean it's totally that. We spend all this time. I don't know how many like little details I've like agonized over trying to draw this thing, and I'm like, but it has nothing to do with the story. And so like, so why am I doing it? Why am I
Yeah.
spending my time on this? Like, let's spend the time on the thing that's actually going to propel the story forward, and the readers are going to actually connect with based upon the story itself. And I think that that's not always an easy lesson. I think that's like one of the hardest lessons is to remember that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of times, not it's all about the big picture, not all the little extra details. Like there's a time and a place for everything, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they can kind of get in the way and bog things down. And depending on how fast you want to kind of get things out too, it's like myself. I know it's like the better I always keep getting at drawing. It's just like it's almost like you get faster, but then you put more detail in, and then you're pretty much about the same speed, if not
About the
slower.
same.
Yeah, it's like it never seems to get like it. Like the process hasn't really gotten any quicker, at least because something kind of
Yeah,
one thing goes up and the other one matches it, and then you're back to square one again.
yeah.
So there is always
I've heard that.
that.
I've heard that like that same idea from a lot of creators. It's like, oh, I've got so much faster, but now I'm doing like more detail, and I'm like the artwork's gotten a lot better. So I guess I didn't get any faster at all. It's like the same. It's the same.
I know it's even one of those ones too, because I've done the Pizza Boys book for 14 issues, all 100% by myself, and sometimes it gets to that point where you're like, man, it'd be nice to have somebody else to work with on this at some point. Because it is that way. You're like, you do shuffle a lot of work. I'm like, just like all those manga artists who got their team of 3 or 4 underneath that get no credit whatsoever. Like, boy, that must be nice. Just to have some people in there.
I always think it's wild too. As an indie creator, you're doing all of it, right? Like, you're writing, you're editing, you're drawing it. If you're coloring it or lettering it, it's all you, right? And then you get to like the bigger guys, or if you get a little bit of funding, you can hire somebody to do a part of that, right? Mm-hmm. But like in manga, the what they have like their assistants and stuff do feels to me is just like maybe it's just my total American school of comics is like, you got the inker and the colorer, and it's it, and but there it's just like you got the person who spots the blacks. I'm like, that's a job? Like, that would be so nice if I could just like do the line work. All right, spot my blacks for me and move on. Yeah. Like, man, what a huge time saver that would be if someone would do that.
Yeah, well, especially back in the day before, like, digital, that was actually a pretty important job throughout, like, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. Somebody had to come in and paint all the blacks in on every single one of those. So, like, you can see how that would be a very time-consuming job, or especially back when someone had to do manual tones. Like, I feel...
Oh, my gosh.
That always... Whenever I think about, having to do manual tones, I'm like... I don't think I'd even do tones if I had to manually do it. I don't know if that sounds like such...
It doesn't seem worth it.
No, I would just do that, the American thing where you just do sort of like the hashes kind of shading instead. Like I would go with that before I start doing cutting out tones and paint and like gluing it all. That always... I mean,
even when you hear about like the OG like color separations that like Marvel and DC used to do and stuff like that for their books, and how they would have to like memorize the numbers of the different shades that they could get and stuff like that to like paint into certain areas. And like that is like, it takes away all of the art of it. And you're just memorizing numbers in connection to what that color might like turn out. And so like, you don't know until it gets printed. I'm like, that just seems maddening. I don't know how those books ever looked as good as they did. Like that doesn't make any sense to me, that like that process is just kind of mind blowing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you can see why. That's why some of them have kind of simpler color schemes, because I think you're like, no more than 16 colors. Like,
we're not doing that.
Yeah,
the character has one color.
All those people in the background are like purplish pink. That's it.
Yeah, and I think that like is something that I love when you see like newer comics, and it's something that when I do color stories and stuff like that I like doing, is kind of doing that stuff. And I think it's just that language of like, they back in the day, that's the way they did it, so it was simple and it was easier for the jobbers just to like come in, clock in, do what they got to do and go home, right? But that became like part of the language of like how we understand comics. So much of the shortcuts and the line work and the word balloons it's a reaction to just saving time and trying to get work out the door. But I love that kind of stuff, like that, just simplifying everybody in the background to one tone. Yep. I love it. I think it just looks so good. And I'm just like, yeah, man, it just separates. I know where the background is. I know where the foreground is, all that stuff. And it's just through simplifying the color down. And I still love that.
Oh, I do too. And I think it's one of those ones, it's because it's artistic almost in a weird way. It's like it was done to be like easier, but realistically it becomes a very cool art choice style. And it's like flat colors. Like sometimes I love books that just have straight up flat colors, no shades, no nothing. And here's an example always is like, in the 90s comic books, when you look through a lot of those ones and everybody got introduced to like gradients and so on like that. And realistically, gradients sometimes is always a bizarre one anyways. There's a time and a place for everything, of course, but a lot of times gradients always look kind of funny. Like they're almost uncanny looking, when you see it in there.
Yeah, totally.
I was thinking like Frank Miller's second Dark Knight book, where like he got it's almost like Frank was just gifted like
Yeah.
Photoshop for the first time, and like, okay, Frank, here you go. Come back with a book in 6 months. Here's some drugs too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like there's a whole slew of books that just like when Photoshop was just in its infancy and being used in comics for the first time, and you look at how it's kind of like they look like they're airbrushed figures, and everybody's like softly glowing, and it's like, okay, like we could back off that, a good amount. Yeah, there's that whole mid to late 90s where it's like we just don't know how to use this tool yet. It's just not, we haven't figured it out. It's not working for everybody.
Yeah, go back to that 16 colors.
Yeah, let's just go back to that. Totally. I think there's examples like of stuff in there that was like, okay, all right, I see how this could be a cool tool and stuff like that. And then there's a lot that's in there done was like they're just like, we just can do any color we want now, and kind of went just a little too wild for sure.
Yeah, no, and it's one of those ones like, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff where like it is dialed in really well and so on, but then there's just some where it's just, you can just tell it's like the artist first. Like as I said, I really feel Frank Miller was just given a computer and Photoshop like to do that second Dark Knight one, and like that's how he was going to go with it. Like come hell or high water, he was going to learn it as he was drawing.
Yeah,
which I almost give him credit for doing it like that too, because it's like, sure, go for it. Like I love weird experimental type stuff like that at the same time. And it's in the longest run, I think that stuff actually will look kind of interesting in a bizarre way, because the farther we get from it, it's kind of like the way that like 90s CG looks in movies. I almost am very nostalgic for it, because it's almost something special in a weird way. And the farther we get away from it, it's kind of cool when it's like the bad CG from the 90s and the movies where they tried a little too hard.
Yeah, no, I totally know what you mean. Like there's I immediately think of that like terrible Spawn movie.
Yeah, that's the first thing you know, it's because of my mind.
And I think about the cape and the chains and some of like the little demons and stuff like that. I'm like, yeah, but that was kind of fun, And I remember like the devil had like that hair texture, that was like he had like these chops, and it had that hair texture that just looked like it came from Rampage, the video game. It was just like that, and on the big screen, like this, this looks like an arcade game.
Yeah,
but you're totally right. Now I look back at it, I'm like, I kind of loved that.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Is I like the farther it gets from it, it's kind of nostalgically kind of neat.
Yeah.
Like I have this other Batman book. I can't remember what the heck the title is off the top of my head, but it came out in like 1991. I found it like at a bookstore. I'm like, oh, this is something that's never going to get reprinted at least. But it's like a super like if someone was just once again gave it a computer for the first time. They're like, just go wild with all the stuff you can do with a computer. It's 1990, like you know what I mean? Like and the stuff in it, it's just bizarre looking. It's got because it's got drawings in it, but then it's got a lot of like computer graphic type stuff in there, which makes just for a very interesting kind of look. But it's like once again, the older that book will get, the more kind of like intriguing it'll almost kind of look. Where like in 1996, you'd be like, oh, that's just so corny and silly. But now it's like you look and go, no, this is really interesting and weird. Like, you know what I mean? Like they're never gonna make a book like this again.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think too, there's several books that came from that time period that have been like reprinted, and they recolor them. That's like always the first thing they do. It's like we're recoloring it, and so then you release it and you see it like that's not how I remember picking this off the racks, and it's probably for the best. But then swing that door on the other side, right, and you get to like the classic like Silver Age stuff, and you get those recolored, and those recolors look so bad. It's just like they cleaned them up, and all that grittiness and the dot system is gone, and they can make them whatever color, and they just polish it too much. And I'm like, this is this isn't what I remember.
It's a weird thing. Like I always thought, like I don't know why. I mean, I know there's probably legal issues of why you can't do it this way, but I always thought that like when they do like graphic novel trades of the old issues, like how cool would it be if they just copied every single page and left all the ads in there and all that stuff and just gave you the original feel? Like here's X-Men, number 6, the way that it was, intended to be in the 60s, and you get it with all the bells and whistles, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I know you'd have to track down every ad company that half of them probably don't even exist anymore. There's too much of that kind of stuff. I wish historically you could preserve them that way.
Yeah, I think that would be such a cool artifact to have, you know. And then I have this collection of like old horror comics, and what they kind of did is it almost looks like they scanned the original pages, like the original art, but like the pages, the
Hmm.
printed pages, and that's more of what you're kind of seeing. And maybe it's a combination of having the original pages and then using the original colors in a kind of way. But the printing that they did in this book is that off white. It's kind of that cream color that those books would have been printed on, you know, or that yellow of the newsprint as they would age, you know. And so it feels like you're looking at an older book, and it
Hmm.
has that feel of like I'm looking at the original pages as it would have been printed. And I'm like, this is how I want to see this stuff. You know, I'd like to, and then the paper has that good texture to it. It's not that just super glossy stuff that you
Hmm.
normally get on like those nice reprints. But this was like had that good texture to it. It had the good color to it. And I was like, this is okay. This, everybody take note. This is what we want right here,
Yep.
you know. And I feel like sometimes, yeah, again, it's like that the the bad part about digital sometimes is you can make everything super clean and look really good, and sometimes it's just like just because you can't does not mean that that's what we want. We don't
Yeah.
necessarily want, that clean. We like the grit. I think that's
Hmm.
why, a lot of like the old comics I got, I like that feel of that paper. There's something about it that just like, man, it scratches apart my brain that,
Hmm.
new book and feel the glossy paper. I'm like, no, this this just doesn't feel like, my childhood of just of those great comics.
Yeah, just the textures and all that kind of feel in the newspaper print, and plus the ads. It's that weird thing that like the
Oh yeah.
ads. I've kind of like thought about this before, but like really like more than like an actual book, a movie, a music, any of that kind of stuff. The thing that can take you back, like pinpointed to like an exact like year and time, more than anything else, is actually an ad.
Yeah.
Ads. I think actually capture the moment much better than any other form of multimedia in a weird way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good point. I can still like, when you mention that, I'm thinking about like ads from comics when I was a kid, and I'm like, yeah, no, there's several that I very clearly remember. I don't know if I remember exactly what it was for, but I
Mhm.
remember the artwork in the ad, like crystal clear. I know exactly what it looked like, and I don't remember what book it was from. I couldn't tell you that, but I remember the ad.
Yeah.
I remember there was a time when I was buying books, and everything had these like I don't remember what the product was, but it was like this. It was kind of like pop rocks, but they were like dinosaur eggs. I don't remember what
Oh, I
what it
remember
was
those.
called, but like this ad was in everything. It was just this dinosaur with this cool like Letterman jacket, like eating these like pop rock eggs. And I remember the ad so clearly, and I'm just like, I don't think I ever ate those and never had them, but I remember the ad, and it was in like, oh man, I think there was just a period of time where everything I was buying off the rack had that
Yeah,
in there
just
somewhere.
they were advertising hard. Of course, the ad wasn't working
Yeah,
on you. You remembered it, but you didn't buy any.
I don't know. I never bought it.
And yeah, now I'm just going to wonder for the rest of my life because they're probably totally out of existence.
Yeah, yeah. Was it my fault that they went out of business because I saw the ad, remember it, never bought it?
Well, going back in the day to what would be you would think the comic book that said, "Hey, I want to make comic books." Like, is there a one pinnacle one, or is it a group
Mm,
of them? Is there that singular book that you kind of read where a lot of times you kind of go, "Hey, you know what? This looks possible right here."
hmm. I think it's a good question. I mean, it probably was just like several comic books. I don't know if there was a specific one. There was a like a book when I was
Hmm.
when I was a kid, and it was called The Cartoonist. I don't remember who it was by, but I read it when I was must have been like second or third grade, right in there. And so it's like an early reader kind of book. But it's about this kid who like spends all of his time in his attic, and he makes comic books. And I just like I fell in love with that story, and I think as a result of reading that story, I started like collecting more comics at the time. And I think at the time, like the big thing that was going on in comics would have been like when Superman split into two entities, if you remember that, like he had the blue Superman and the red. And so I remember like those were just everywhere. They were everywhere. And this was, in my little hometown, there wasn't a comic book shop. So as the comics you get had to be on the newsstand. And that's just what we had. It was like you didn't get to be choosy. It's like that's what you got had access to. So I read like a bunch of those Supermans of him splitting into two. There was a couple Marvel books thrown in there. And I would definitely say as I like got more into comics, I definitely swung the Marvel direction because again, that's all I had. So I didn't even know Dark Horse, any of that stuff, that there was this whole other world. There was like this just newsstand. This is what you got, and then maybe you got Archie, and that seemed like lame. I didn't want to read those because then you look at Superman, you're like, oh man, he's red and blue Superman, he's all electricity, and I was like, I'm not messing around with Archie. And now I'm like, oh yeah, Archie's great. Why would I
exactly. Like well, yeah, it's Betty Veronica, all that stuff. They're always having a good old time.
It's awesome. Why didn't I read that? But anyways, and so I think those books were ones that like came out when I was in that age where I was like, I want to make comics and stuff like that. But then in terms of like when, in high school, when I really started thinking about telling stories and stuff like that, it would have been Mignola and Mike Mignola and Hellboy. Like I came to that when I was in high school, and it just like, it blew my mind. I'd never seen art that was as interesting as what he was doing at that time. And the stories were like, oh, you can do this? You can do this in a story? And it's just like, again, no comic book shop. See it on the newsstand, pick it up, And that was like right after, when I was in high school, was right when they stopped. You couldn't buy comics on newsstands anymore. And they ended that. And then it became the direct market. And so like my comic book reading had to translate to like going to like Barnes and Noble and picking up graphic novels. And reading like trade paperbacks, specifically. And so that's where I came across like Dark Knight, Returns, and coming to lots of Hellboy and stuff like that. And that's where I really thought like, okay, I can maybe start like coming up with some stories and stuff like that. And then went to college and didn't really pursue it anymore. Fell in love with painting, became a painter. And then coming back to comics, it was totally like I'm trying to remember who was the first one. Like I when I picked him back up, that I was like, okay, I'm gonna make a book, and I think it was probably Adrian Tomina's The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist. It's funny, but it's more of like a serious, like introspective book. It's like autobiographical about him. But it is great. It told a story of like him as a kid who he wanted to be a comic book artist and how he was kind of like bullied for that. And then he became one, and he's like, kind of a solitary lifestyle. You're at the drawing table all the time and stuff like that. And, I was like, man, I really want to get back into making comics. And that was like the first book I read, kind of getting back into it during COVID, where I was like, okay, I'm going to sit down and make my first book. And then here we are now, and I'm headed to Baltimore in 2 weeks with I've got 6 books under my belt that I'll have for Baltimore. And it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, there you go, knocking them out and everything like that. Yeah, it's funny kind of how that is. And it's always interesting to see the kind of the path that kind of like, from which books kind of like inspired you and so on. It's like my whole life too. It's like I always had like I always call them the random single issues that like you kind of got as a kid, where like totally. They're not connected to anything. It's like, here's this one X-Men, here's one Johnny Quest, here's one one Star Wars one, and you're trying to make heads or tails on like the stories because you've come in like way in between stories and so on like that. And then it was kind of like one's graphic novels. That was like where it felt like, okay, now this is kind of all coming together. They're not just random single issues from the spinner rack anymore,
Yeah, totally.
And the big one for me was when I saw Scott Pilgrim. When that book came out, that was
Oh,
the one
sure.
where I was like, I looked at this and I go, because the way the artwork is, and so I'm like, oh, this is not just like a Batman or a Spider-Man or any of these ones like this. This actually looks like you could draw this and you could work out. It's not putting anything down, but like it's one of those ones like that artwork looked like, okay, this looks like the everyman artwork, not the okay. If you were not drawing from the age of 2, there's no way you'll be able to do this. Because I always feel like Jim Lee artwork is like the most like turn off to like anything. It's like it's great and it's amazing, but you're like, yeah, obviously
I'm
didn't
not
start.
I'm not gonna draw that. Like I can't hit that benchmark. No, you're totally. Yeah, I think that.
Yeah,
I think that those like as you kind of put it, those everyman artists. I think everybody kind of has one of those. That was like, okay, all right, I could, yeah. I don't know, and I don't know that if like Mignola was that for me or not, but I definitely know that like I saw the artwork and I was like, okay, like Mignola's doing something like where he's just like simplifying the figure down to its like barest bones, and it's still really complicated. Like if you actually break down trying to draw some of his stuff, is like, okay, this is actually really hard, but there's something in it that is that kind of like it's simple and it feels doable in a way.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's kind of it, is like when you kind of find that one where it's like it's almost like it clicks and you're like, okay, I kind of see how this works and so on like that, and it's starting to all make a little bit more logical sense. And you're not looking at like a Todd McFarlane or a Greg Capullo or any of those kind of guys that just have like that almost like over the top. But then also you're not like, as a time when you're a kid putting that together too, you're not going like, yeah, he's also got like 3 other people working with him to make that artwork look like the way it does. It's not just he's not the only one doing it, one of those things. But yeah, when you kind of get that one where it's like, okay, there's that book. And I always like those in a sense, like the writer artist books. To me, that always stands out a lot more than when there's a writer and there's an artist and everything's sort of separate. It's the way I kind of look at it. It's like when you see movies and there's a writer director. I always think those movies are stronger than when there's a random writer and then the director's just doing it like because it's like a job. Not saying those movies can't be great too, but we all know at the end of the day, mostly it seems like if you get one where it's like, hey, writer, director, especially also producer, maybe even stars in or something like that, that it's going to be much more of a passion project.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is just like how much investment that artist is putting into the work. I think it comes out in the work itself, right? It's yeah. I agree with that. Of like, I think that was one of the reasons I liked and gravitated towards Dark Knight Returns, because it's like, it's he has Klaus on it and stuff like that, but at the same time it's like he wrote it and then he drew it, and so in a lot of ways it is his vision all the way through, and it's like, some other people are helping, like Lee is doing the colors and so on and so forth, but for the most part that's still his vision all the way through, and then same thing with Mignola or whoever. Yeah, I think being able to see that singular vision is cool, and it's inspiring in a way. You're like, okay, so I can make this story, and then when you hear Mignola talk about it, like his art career and like how he makes his books, of just like he avoids things. See, like I don't like drawing cars, and I don't like drawing women, so like they're just never in my books. Yeah, like, holy crap! I've never seen him draw a car.
God, yeah, cars one of those ones. Sometimes I'll have issues. I'm like, why do I have this car in here for so long? Like, that's always such more of a such an extra task to draw a car, especially like to the point where it's just like, okay, I got pictures of this car from each angle so I can see what it looks like on each side, because not all sides are the same now, and all that stuff. But it makes sense. Yeah, you kind of gear towards what you like and so on like that. And yeah, Frank Miller, that's like one of those ones. Like I always think he's one of the best kind of go-to guys where you're getting a Frank Miller book when you buy his stuff. There isn't a disconnect, and even like a lot of times, even writers I like, sometimes it's like there can be like a disconnect in certain books when like just the artist shifts, and it's just like, something feels off now. It's just it's not as personal and so on like that. It's another book that's always a big one to me, especially for Pizza Boys, is anything that Terry Moore does. The guy who did Strangers in Paradise. I love that one because he's just like pretty much does it all himself. It's kind of the slice of life kind of murder mystery stuff thrown in there. And I think that you just feel a lot more when there's just those like almost like a little bit more pure creators and so on. And even when it gets down to like indie books, like one thing that's kind of I feel like it's a definite like tough choice to make is when you get guys that they want to write, but then they kind of buy an artist. And something, I don't know, I hate to sort of say, it's not saying that there's like that can't be done, but sometimes it's like, if it's not like, it's different if it's like, hey, I want to write a story and my buddy over here is going to draw it. We're kind of in together on that works really well because now you get a team.
Oh yeah.
But when you sort of get a guy who's, on the other side of the earth drawing it for you, I feel like there's sometimes a disconnect in those books too. Like there's something that always feels kind of off. Like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like the soul's missing is almost like the I don't know the way I guess you say it. And it's not saying the book can't be good, but it's something once it comes back to like an uncanny thing.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. The book that I just finished actually was a collaboration, and it was the first one I ever did. Where I have the publisher that I go through in comics, where everything I've been publishing through, so the kind of main guy at Lesser Known Comics, are kind of like CEO, or I don't know if he has like an official title, but his name is Mark, and he wrote this book. And back when I first like pitched It's a Horror Show and publishing books with him and stuff like that, we had discussed like working together and doing something because he liked my art style, and I was like, yeah, I think that'd be a lot of fun. So he kind of wrote this book with me in mind, of what. Like playing to what I like to draw on and my strengths and stuff like that. And so then we like had a couple of meetings where we bounced ideas back and forth about like the book and stuff like that. And before I even like really put pen to paper and started drawing the thing. And so then when I drew it, I felt like I really understood the story as like a creator of like, this is part of me now. And it wasn't just here's the script, go forth, monkey, and do it just like this. Do not stray. I had like a lot of leeway to be like, I'm just going to go ahead and cut that and edit. And so I was like making edits and stuff like that as I was working on the book, and I had a lot more freedom to do it. And I think as a result, like I'm really proud of what this book turned into. It's going to be released for Baltimore. It's called Dead and Still Dying. And it's just like kind of a fun story of this like group of kids who kind of encounter this witch, and it's got very Stranger Things, Goonies vibes. It's a lot of fun, but as a result of like that working a relationship where it wasn't just like I was handed something and told you got to do it just like this. It was very much like that. It was like a conversation to get to the art. And to get to that kind of finish point. And I think that's, again, where those projects and stuff like that, like I have to imagine like good duos, I think there's tons of really great duos out there. Like I think Frank Quitely and Grant Morrison are a phenomenal duo. But I can't imagine that Grant Morrison just hands Frank Quitely a script and it's just like, just do it like this. I have to imagine there's like back and forth, you know what I mean? And I think that like it's got to be that kind of working relationship that like yields the really cool projects, and like the where the artist understands the story not just as like this is my job, I have to execute this, but it's like this is also my passion. I want to execute this story with my friend, and I think that's where those collaborations are better for sure.
Yeah. Well, and that's the key thing is I think just like your project, you're all involved in it there. I think it's that one where there's just the people that are like almost work for hires, and that's kind of about all they are. And it's not saying anything against it. I'm not saying that could totally work out too. I think.
I think so.
But I do think it is definitely a roll of the dice though for like when it comes to some of the indie books though. Is I will say just some of the ones I've seen along the way. I'm not, I know some guys it's like that's what they're going with, and if that's your plan of action, by all means. But sometimes just make sure that the soul is still there and it doesn't just kind of feel like a So some people they can it's not that they don't draw real well, but there's like almost like kind of a. It even happens in sometimes some of the off like Marvel and DC books, like the ones that aren't like the main ones, where I always feel like I always call it like the generic comic book artwork. It's the one that looks like somebody went to school and passed all their classes and did a great job and
knows how to do it. Yeah.
But they're missing like the characteristics that like almost like is what makes artwork sometimes kind of cool. Like in a sense, the guys that like I would almost say are better artists are technically worse artists, but their artwork looks more unique. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, I totally agree. I think the first time I ever really recognized that in like one of the big two was this issue of Robin. And I don't even know why I picked it up. I just like picked up this book and bought it. And I was like looking at the
Mhm.
artwork and I was like, man, it just feels like whoever drew this just straight up phoned it in. Just did not, and it's like good, the
Yeah,
drawings are like competent drawings. Like
yeah,
there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with them, but they're just not interesting. It's just
yeah.
like they just clocked in and clocked out on this book, and it's, yeah. And I think that's what happens when you have so many books. And yeah, you're right. It's not like they're doing the next Batman, which like they get the rock stars to do those books. It's just like they get these like side characters and like, okay, we got to release X amount of titles this year, and we're doing this one. And just, all right, just give it to this, to this newbie, or the guy who's on salary to just like, he's got a
Yeah.
contract, he's got to do whatever book we tell him to. And I think that's what sometimes happens. And I think it's why like I tend to, when I go into a comic book shop now, gravitate all the way to indie books, and especially the more experimental, weirder, small press stuff, the better. I think there's just more interesting stuff going on than the big guys that these big contracts to do it and stuff like that. And it just, yeah, I don't see a whole lot of soul happening in it, and it's
Hmm.
an intangible that like some people care about, and some people are like, yeah, but it's Batman, or whatever, and they're willing to forgive a lot of that stuff. And I think when you get to do it yourself and see that kind of stuff, you're more inclined to like, I'm gonna be selective and grab the stuff that I think actually is resonating with me versus just like this random title by a jobber.
Yeah, and a lot of times I feel there's so many books, you got to cherry pick everything, pick what really stands out to you. Don't worry about having to keep up with anything and so on like that. I hate to always say it, but like as far as superhero books goes, I probably could stick to all the old ones till the end of time and I still would have more than
Yeah,
enough stuff to read you
totally.
know what I mean? Like it's like one of those ones we have enough history of all that stuff that like you could live off so many of those older books and have all the great stories and all kinds of stuff. And yeah, and then by the time you read through them, if anything, you have to reread them again anyways because you went through so much. So it
Yeah,
is that kind
totally.
of that one. It's funny though to go to a comic book store and I like to ask them like, "Hey, where's your?" I call it the indie test, and I go, "Where's your indie books at?" And if they take me to Image, I go, no, 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 no. Image is that. Let's be like, look at all the people that are working at Image. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they're
Yeah.
all big name guys from Marvel and DC. Like, you know what I mean? Yeah, they get to go
No, yeah, it
do
totally is.
their own little thing. I'm not saying anything about because the Image has great books, but I always think it's funny when people say, or they'll say like Dark Horse or something. It's like Dark Horse, like everything they have is licensed. How is an
Yeah.
Aliens book like indie, or
Yeah.
IDW? It's like Power Rangers, that's indie. Like, it's always people like,
No, for
how'd you get a
sure.
job
Yeah.
here?
When that's what's in the indie selection and stuff like that, and you're like, no. I like when the comic book shop like has it spaced out to like, you know, um, you have your big two, and they put that in a section, but they
Mhm.
separate it. So it's like, okay, there's the big two. I'm like, okay, perfect. I don't have to
Yeah.
go over there unless I'm really hard up, or there's like, like again, sometimes like there's an indie artist who will do like a book in the big two. I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna grab that because I think that's gonna be rad.
Mhm.
But other than that, like I'll just move to the other side. And then when they space it out to have like your small press section, I'm like, okay, this is
There we go.
home. This is where I want to be. Because now I know we're not talking, hundreds of thousands of copies. We're talking like, in some cases, maybe a couple hundred copies of these
Mhm.
books ever made. And like, these are guys that you need that money, like need that support. And I think you end up getting more wild books. They're just like, how did I miss this? How was this under my radar, that I didn't even see it come out? And it ends up being more fun to get those books. And I think too, the other thing that I end up like buying so many more books on Kickstarter right now. Like,
Mhm.
one, I end up launching a lot of my our projects through Lesser Known Comics get launched via Kickstarter, which I think is a good way to connect with readers and stuff like that. And I think it works. But you end up scrolling around on Kickstarter and you see some projects. You're like, holy shit, this looks cool. Like, this is what I want to read, And so I think that if comic book shops want to keep up with where I think the actual indie industry is heading, they gotta be pushing more of that small press stuff,
Yeah. Well, plus too, because you get some comic book shops too, and they get weird about indie comic books. They're like, whoa, we don't want any indie comic books here. And you're like, dude, like, what do you got to lose? I hate to sort of say it. You're running you're acting like you're Walmart, and I came in here asking you to sell my book or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of bizarre that some places, that they just they won't, like, they just don't want to have indie whatsoever. Like, they're like, no, we, like, and then it's like, it's like, IDW as far as we're gonna go, and all that kind of stuff. We carry a copy on Ani Press books, but
it's so wild. Like, and I think that sometimes the smaller area you're in, that's kind of what you run up against too. Like, I know there's in Montana, there's only a handful of comic book stores. There's just not a whole lot out there, And so, but when I go to larger cities and whatnot, you get your pick. And so I will always look ahead of time and like, okay, do they take, are they selling indie books or not? And if they're not, I'm like, okay, I don't know that I'm going to waste my time going to a store that actually doesn't sell them. One of the stores that I love, and it's because they don't sell any of they don't go through Diamond, they don't go through Penguin, they don't do any of that stuff, but it's a comic book store, and it's out in Seattle, and it's called Push Pull, and they only do small press and zines, and it's That's cool. A total, and it's great. You go in there and you're like, man, I've never seen this anywhere, and you see some stuff that was just made in-house by people in a workshop or just living around the corner and just selling some cheap zines and stuff like that. And I went in there, I just came out with this fat stack of comics. I was like, because it was stuff that I was like, man, I've never seen this before, and I'm gonna love it, because it's somebody pouring their heart and soul into something versus just someone just clocking in, clocking out,
Yeah, and it's just such a bummer. Like, it's like I kind of hate to sort of say it with so many of those stories too. It's like, what do you got to lose? Like, all you gotta do is put one spinner rack. Like, you have, everybody has floor space for that. Like, don't give me that excuse.
Totally.
You can just do one spinner rack that just has pure indie on it. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
where's your local? Let's get the local spinner rack of dudes that are local putting out comics. That would be so it would be so amazing. And you're right. Like, I rarely see that in shops. And I think the ones that rare. I do, when I do, it's just like, okay, this is a haven. This is a good one. Like, all right, I will remember this shop for forever. They always have my business. And then the ones where they just no, that's not our thing. It's like, what? Why? Why isn't it your thing?
Well, I just, to me, I just don't get it. Like, it's almost like they give you sometimes a look like you're asking them to sell pornographic videos there or something like that. Like, you're like, you would just think a comic book store would be the first place that would be pretty darn. And it's a mom and pop place. It's not like we're asking at places that are Borders or something like that. It's one of those ones. It's so bizarre that so many places will turn down indie stuff. And a lot of times for me, I'm like, oh, you don't like indie? Okay, I guess I won't ever see you guys again. I'll go to the next guy and buy books from him. No,
totally. Yeah.
Because that's just one of those ones, Because even when I go to Comic Cons, that's always the first thing I always want to look for. Is I want to find books where I go, where is a book that I can't find anywhere else? I mean, maybe I could find it online, but I'd have to specifically know where to search for it. That's what makes Comic Cons kind of fun. So that's what kind of bummed me out for a while when Comic Cons were like, man, there's no comic book people at any of these ones for the most part.
Sure.
Because that to me seems like the cool thing. I've always wanted to start a Comic Con that was one of those ones where it was just all indie creators, whether you be a writer or an artist, but that was all it is. You sell it that way so that people know what they're getting into. No action figures, no Funko Pops, no memorabilia, none of that stuff. There's a time and a place for that, but you're coming just specifically to meet, indie creators, writers, all that kind of stuff. Do the meet and greet, find some new books you can't find anywhere else. I always thought that would be a cool one to have. It's just you could do
Yeah.
it in a small scale. You don't. It doesn't really have to be that big. If you had 25 guys, there you go. That's enough for an event. Like, believe me, that's more than like some of the biggest cons I've ever seen in California. Like the amount of comic book people that have been there. So
That's wild. Yeah, I mean, even at at Comicverse Con, I think there was maybe like, I want to say like five or six that were actually like indie comic creators, and
yeah,
then everything else was more or less collectibles. And again, like, yeah, I think they sold themselves as that kind of an event and stuff, and it totally made sense. But I was like, yeah,
Mhm.
I was kind of like hoping that there would be more creators here. It was kind of weird that there wasn't a bigger show of that. But yeah, I mean, something like that, of like, just a huge, swatch of just creators,
Yeah.
and you'd have to find the right city and all that, da 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 da. But I think, yeah, I mean, I agree. I think something like that would be really cool to put on and to have. Um, I mean, I would go to that. That
That's what I
sounds
mean. Like,
great.
because to me, that feels like that's 100% like, especially before I even had a comic book. Like that was the main thing I looked for when I went to Comic Cons. That's what I wanted to find. So the idea that, like, yeah, and as I said, if as long as you advertise it that way, so everybody kind of knew what they were getting into, I think that would be kind of a cool one. And if anything, you could always throw in novelist or anything like that. Like that would be fine. Like they could go in there if they
Yeah,
want to.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
you can't resell stuff. You can't buy things off AliExpress and sell it. Because that's the thing is, like, there's so many places where you see someone's booth and you go, did you literally just print all that off the internet? Like it's like you could at least draw Goku. Like, come on, gosh. As I say, it's like even fan art. I got a little bit of a mixed feeling about too. Sometimes it's like
I get
it's
that.
nothing wrong if you got a couple of pictures around your booth or whatever. You did some extra drawing. Nothing wrong there. But I think when someone like that's all they have, it's like there's just like 50 images in the back that are just you just drew pictures from TV shows and stuff and selling that. Like, first and foremost, let's all be honest, that is illegal in some ways, but it's one of those weird things that gets
Yeah.
let slide. But sometimes I
Yeah,
kind
it's
of
like a
find out like
weird gray area in comic book shows, right? It's just like, oh, okay, so like we've been warned about like don't do this, and then like in comic book shows, I guess it's kind of fine. It's
yeah,
yeah,
it's just like they
it's
just let that
bizarre.
go.
It's bizarre.
And the way I always kind of look at it, I kind of call it like it's like cheating in a weird way. Cause like that's the thing. It's like you're cheating for people's attention instead of actually producing something that like is here's a real brand new story. Here's something unique. Here's
Yeah.
something independently made, and so on like that. And then you're super cheating when you also just print things offline and slap it into different things and say it's yours.
Yeah.
That's the one that it blows my mind that those booths like still just exist every single time I go to a Comic Con.
I think when you're a creator and artist and stuff like that, and to make your own thing and to like trust that people will like respond to it and be into it and like what you're doing, there's like this it's scary. There's like this leap of faith you have to take that like people are going to like what you make,
Mm-hmm.
and then what you come up with. If you draw like a drawing of Captain America and you're competent at drawing Captain America and you rinse and repeat and just do it over and over and over again, or other superheroes or other characters, whatever, right? Like you don't have to put yourself out there as much. You
Yeah.
can kind of hide behind like this character that everybody knows, and so maybe it feels like that's like a safer way to make a buck, and to sell that kind of stuff. But I think that like um, I think that people respond to just put yourself out there, make the thing
Mm-hmm.
that you want. Tell me your story, and I and that's the stuff that I get into. And when I go to like a show or whatever, I'm just like, yeah, just tell me your story. Like I don't necessarily care if you can draw Superman or Batman. Like that's cool. There's 20
Yeah.
guys here who can do that. But like what's the character you draw? Where does your mind go? And I want to see that. And to be fair, some of those dudes that do the fan art stuff, it can be fun, and I
Mm-hmm.
like some of that stuff, and maybe they do like cool techniques or do it in a different way that's not seen, and I think there's space for that. But like I truly think that like doing putting yourself out there and making something new that's like just yours, I think is I don't know, it's so much more exciting to me than than just seeing another drawing of Superman
Yeah,
or something like that, you know.
it's there's not anything unique or anything. But the one thing I will say is like when people do sometimes realize like once they see your book and then they realize it is your book and it's not like something else, there is that sometimes reaction like, oh, you make this, and like that's always the cool one. Or like, because I think that like the downfall is because like they've allowed so much of that fan artwork to be in there. I think people think that that's what everything is. I think that's I hate to sort of say it, but the average Joe I think is associated Comic Cons with it's just a bunch of fan artwork and AliExpress stuff and all these things that are kind of there. And so when they do see it, sometimes there is that reaction they get where they jump back and it kind of blows their mind for a split second that like somebody can actually physically draw this whole book on their own.
Yeah, it's crazy that you mentioned that. I got that when I was in Sacramento. There was like several people who were just like, "Oh wait, this is your book? You made this?" And it's like, "Yeah, yes, yeah." That's I got a banner back here. It says my name, says the book title. It's like, yes, that's me. That's what I did. I made this thing, and yeah, it's almost like the expectation that you're just like second marketing or something. You know what I mean? It's just like, oh yeah, I bought this off the rack. I just bought like 60 copies of this one book. I'm just selling it aftermarket, and it's like that became the norm in a way of just like of that. The thing that I saw that I was just like blown away by was there were some like kind of there was a couple of people that were like voice actors and stuff like that at the con, which was like kind of cool. But I saw like people bringing in like wagons full of toys and stuff like that, and books and posters and stuff to have those people sign, not because that's their collection, but because they're going to go resell that collection.
Yep.
And I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't clocking that was a thing, and see like person after person with these truckloads of stuff. And then realizing that, like, the people who were signing autographs sometimes were charging upwards of like $60 per autograph. And they're like, well, I'm not going to get all this stuff signed. And you're like, yeah, I wouldn't either. 500 things, Holy cow.
I remember that was a big shocker. The very first time I ever went to a Comic-Con was, it was a big Sacramento one. The first time I ever went, and that thing that you paid $50 to get in the door, and then you kind of like when you go up, you go, oh, all these guys are charging like $30 to $50 to like shake their hand or take a picture with them or something like that. Like that to me was like a mind blowing. Like what? Like I already paid $50 to get in, and they want more money from me. I already bought their movies and someone like that. Like how much more do they need? Damn it!
Yeah.
like that to me, I was like, it got to the point where like. Like I remember the first person I saw Lou Ferrigno. I just ran up to him like, the lady's like, it's $30 for a photo or for a, or for like an autograph. I was like, can I just shake his hand? And it was so early in the day. She's like, I think it was like the one was like, whatever, go for it. And then I went like, hey, Lou Ferrigno, what's going on? I'm so glad to meet you. I love you and Pumping Iron and all that kind of stuff. And like, you can see he shook my hand. He was all like, cool. But like he would have been much happier if I had $30 in my hand.
Yeah. I think it's kind of wild. Like you pay for the entrance fee, and I'm like, okay, but what is that entrance fee actually paying for? Is it just like the event, or what? Because everything after that point costs money. Nothing. You go to a con, it is nothing's free. I expected to go to a con and just be like, yeah, you're gonna get swag. Like some of that stuff. No.
Yep.
That's super rare. Like I think that there's a couple booths that will do that, and I that's one of the things that like my publisher is great at, is like we print off a lot of swag, and so we have like at our booths like a lot of free stuff. Like we print off postcards and bookmarks and stuff like that we can give to people that have our like emails or whatever on them and stuff like that. And I think that like when you give anybody something free at a con, they're just like, what? Free? And it's like, because that's not the norm by any means. They're totally expecting like, okay, how much does this cost? No, you don't get it. This is just for you. It's free. I'm not asking you to spend $30. You're good. And they're just like they're not expecting that,
Yeah, it's like I remember there was I'm trying to blank on his name right now, but he was an artist for Green Lantern, and I remember running up to him at like the original Comic-Con I went to, and it was like, oh man, I really want to meet this guy. Stuff. It's like, oh, you get that thing like, well, I don't want to like have to if he wants money, it's maybe not that. I remember like he's like, just come on up, I'll sign it for you, and like we were like going to our wallets, like, dude, don't worry about it. I'm just gonna sign the book for you. Like I was like, dude, what a cool guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Need more stuff like that, you know,
Yeah,
because
and
that's
you
the weird
get,
thing is you get to that point where like you see somebody like, that'd be a cool person to meet. Not $30 cool though.
yeah, I don't know that I'm gonna spend money on that. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, for
they're
sure.
not
And
that cool.
I think that like you get a lot of creators who are like totally fine and like they're like, yeah, no, I'm not going to charge you for this. And then you like it was crazy. I was at New York Comic Con last year just as like a fan,
Mm.
and they would have some of these big name artists in there like Jim Lee and stuff like that was signing, and the line was like crazy long, and you had to pay to like go get his book signed and just to meet him in general. And I
Yeah.
was like, okay, I don't know that I'm going to do that. And then like across the convention hall, I see Klaus Janson, and he's signing books, and I'm like, okay, and no one was in line for Klaus. I was like, what the fuck? No
Yeah, come
one's
on.
in line for Klaus. And I went over and like we had like a 10-15 minute conversation, and he ended up signing my book and drew like a little sketch of Batman for me free.
Yeah. See,
And it was just like, dude, this was Klaus Jan. Like I put him higher than Jim Lee in my mind. But
yep.
like, and so it's just like you don't know who's going to be that person that's like who's charging and who's not, and who decides this. I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of
It's such
it's
a
wild.
it's a weird one because it's like, yeah, it's like, it's, it's one of those ones, like, because that's how it sort of should be. Like, let's be honest, all the people that coming up to you in line have already spent quite a bit of money probably on you in the past. Like,
Yeah,
it's almost like
totally.
supposed to be like, it needs to be almost the other way around where it's like, I'm thanking you guys for buying
Yeah,
stuff.
thank you for just for being a fan for this long, and like and stuff. I'm here to like kind of
Yeah.
pay that forward in a way, and it's just like that's not what it is.
Yeah. It's such a weird one that like, yeah, it's just one of those ones where, yeah, there's very few people that I would even consider paying. But a lot of times I just look and go, oh, there's that person. Oh, that's kind of cool. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's cool. Hey, look,
That's what I mean. Like a lot of times you just
I
kind of
don't
go up
have to
and you
go
can
meet them.
yeah, you could stand like at the edge of like the gate and you're like, well, there they are 25 feet away. That's
Yeah,
probably just as good as meeting them.
that's
I
good
mean,
enough.
let's be honest. If I get in line, what am I going to do? It's not like I'm going to have a conversation with them or anything like that.
Yeah, that's going to be like anything life changing and stuff like that, and especially with somebody that you admire, it's just like I don't know, like there's a
Yeah.
chance that's not going to go well, they're not going to live up to your expectation, whatever. But 25 feet away, yeah, they lived
Yeah.
up just
Yeah,
fine.
there they go. It's a perfect place, you know.
Yeah,
So some of those kind of bizarre things like that and so on. But yeah, it would just be kind of nice if these Comic Cons like almost promoted like the indie comics and all just comic books in general. I feel just a little bit higher up. Like it's even like some of just like the smaller conventions. Like sometimes I feel like you shouldn't charge the entry fee for the indie comic books the same price that you charge for the guys selling merchandise that they can just buy from
yeah,
anywhere. Like I feel
yeah.
like it's one of those ones like I have a buddy in England who makes comic books, Craig Johnson. He makes one called Project Savior. And what he told me is like in England, for all the Comic Cons there, like you pay like £25 to reserve your booth. They give you that
Okay.
money back when you show up. That's all it is because they
It's just
want
like it's just to hold it.
it's just to hold it.
Oh.
So, but indie comic book people seem to be treated like in a nice, higher regard there, where it's like, God, that's the way it should be. Like, I hate to sort of say it, but like, I shouldn't be paying the same price for a booth that a guy who's going to be selling a bunch of stuff out of his garage. You know what I mean? Like, that seems kind of. It's not. We're never going to make the same amount of money, but it's like the guy. Yeah,
No. Yeah.
it's just logistics. Like, what. So I think
No,
there
I
also
mean
needs to be a
totally.
little bit more indie appreciation. You know what I mean? Like it should be that
Yeah,
one where there's like
like
tiers. There should be
yeah, it
indie
should be like
comics.
let's keep the comics in the Comic Con. Let's give these cats just a little bit of a little bit of a break, instead of like the guys who are just gonna have a big booth that they're just gonna sell 20 action figures and make what I made the entire weekend.
Yeah, they got Pikachu stuffed animals for days. They're gonna sell them all. You know,
Yeah, totally.
it's that kind of stuff that I feel like the tier needs to almost kind of go up from like indie, comic book creators, fan artists, and then like merchandisers, and so on. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a weird system that it's kind of got locked into that I feel almost needs to be like stirred up a little bit and just a little bit new
I think that's a good
blood being
point,
thrown
yeah.
in, because it's almost become too much, and it's overbreached and everything. It's not saying that there can't be good comics, but I just feel like, you just don't know. Like what I do when I go to a Comic-Con now is I kind of try to look at like the other people that have already signed up. And I go, how many people are books? You know what I mean? That's my key thing. Comics or novels, I don't care. I feel like the novel guys probably have even a harder time than we do.
Yeah.
Where all the struggles that like indie comic people do, like, I feel like I always see about someone who has like a 400-page novel. I go, man, that's got to be it. If I have a hard time finding people that read, you really got to have a hard time finding people that read. That's all I think about.
Totally. Yeah, I agree.
So like I always get like, like the novelists, by all means, like, power to them and so on. But I would like to just see a little bit more indie appreciation at kind of things like that, because that's the thing. It's like, sometimes it's like that thing that like, you got to get that extra, all the exposure you can. And even like, I always thought a cool thing to do would be to have like, where like in a Comic-Con, you sort of, when they sometimes separate different sections and so on like that, like sometimes they have Artist Alley, which mostly just means fan art. And then they have like merchandise. So they really should have an indie section where like, give it a banner that says, hey, indie comic books right here. You know exactly what you're getting into when you walk in. Group them all together, because I always think it's weird when they don't group them together too. Because
and everybody's kind of all over the place. Totally.
Because that's always a bizarre one too. Because if you sit next to two fan artists, I think people think that you must be a fan artist too. They just don't know what your material is. That's the worst part there.
It makes it even harder in some ways. But if you're next to like 3 or 4 other creators, I can see that it's just like, people get it. It's just like, okay, okay, these are they made these books.
It makes sense and so on. So I don't know.
Yeah,
it's one of those ones I would love to see more of that kind of stuff there. And hopefully, I think like people will kind of get it at some point and go, okay, we need to kind of, these things have sort of gotten out of control. We need to kind of reel them in a bit and so on. And try some new tactics and whatnot. And I think for a lot of indie books too, I still think sometimes like trying to find people online and, getting stuff that way does help out a lot, because you're getting direct to readers and so on like that.
Totally.
Almost in a weird way, you might almost find more stuff that way. I know there's all kinds of, you got like webtoons and so on there, but that to me, it almost feels that's so completely, it's almost like a third format that like, it's not really comic books. It's not really manga anymore. Now it's in its own thing.
Own thing, totally.
It's you almost have to make your book in that mindset before you even start it. Like it's like it doesn't really work well if you want to have your book as a print book. You can't really have both in a sense. It's one or the other. Mm-hmm. So I feel that one.
And then if you ever see something that was made in that format and then it goes to print, like granted there are good examples of that, but like there are plenty of examples where like it just doesn't work. And it's like, that format's off. This was meant to be like, I was meant to be able to zoom into this and see it in infinite, and as soon as it gets printed, it's just like flat. And now it's nope, it's not what it was. And I still like print, I don't know. I don't like, my job is on the screen, as a teacher and stuff, I'm constantly doing stuff on screen and answering emails all day. And so the last thing I want to do is for enjoyment's sake, is just like, let's just look at my computer screen more. I want to hold the thing.
No, I understand. That's even the same way I feel about video games. Like, computer games are fun and all that stuff, but I feel like I need to separate from the computer after working on it a bunch and go play video games on a console. There's a transfer that needs to kind of happen there and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, all kinds of good stuff in there. And Jade, I know it's getting a little bit later on your end out there, so I don't want to hold you up too much. But where is the good place that everybody can go to get your books and your information?
Yeah, sure. So my Instagram handle is just at Jade Lowder. And there you can find links to current Kickstarter projects and my Patreon and stuff like that, where I release new pages from books every Monday, or try to as much as I possibly can. And then in terms of getting the actual print books in your hand, you can go to lesserknowncomics.com and you can find all the other books that we print there, in addition to my books, It's a Horror Show, and coming soon, Dead and Still Dying.
Awesome. Well, all kinds of fun stuff there. Jay's got amazing artwork that I think is definitely a must check out. I love it. I love the black and whiteness. I love the rockabilly punk horror stuff. I mean, it sold me on that one right off the bat. Like I was like, no, this is cool. This is my kind of book, you know. So I look forward to more stuff that you bring out, and then maybe we'll just happen to run into a Comic-Con again. You never know.
Yeah.
Even though I know we're much more separated than I initially thought we were. But
you know, in Montana, any place that you want to go to do a Comic-Con, you have to travel. So, like, I think there will be the Comics Cons in the future where I'll have to go to the West Coast for sure. So, yeah, I think there's a good chance.
Gosh, that's how I felt just being over in Yosemite. I felt like I was always the guy that had to travel everywhere. It's like everything's a 2-hour drive for me just to get out to any place.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as something close. No comic book store, no Comic-Cons, all that kind of stuff. But you just get used to that travel.
The closest comic book store to me is 2 hours away.
That's the same for me. That's literally the closest one. Exactly 2 hours, like on the dot. But yeah, you know, that's okay. That's just kind of what happens. Gives good places for creativity and creation and all that stuff. But Jade, thanks for coming on. We got to do this again. We had a good old time here. I felt like as well as when we talk all kinds of stuff. We can talk movies and all sorts of stuff next time. We didn't even get to any of that kind of stuff. I was going to say, hey, what the movies inspired you? I saw that you got the horror themes there. I mean, like that feels like a subject in itself.
Yeah. Next time, let's just chug through the horror movies. I think that sounds like a good time.
I'm all down for that. Well, till then, you can always go to oldmanorange.com where you'll find all the podcasts I do via VHS, Old Man Orange podcast, of course, Spencer Scott Holmes podcast, and then Pizza Boys Comics, got that up there with all the old animations, videos, all that kind of fun stuff. Till then, I'm Spencer Scott Holmes with special guest.
I'm Jade Lowder.
And we will see you some other time.
Tell no lies. It's such a crazy